Hello everyone and welcome. Today we're going to talk about capitalism and its critics. Let's start with an overview. Okay, so what we're going to do is we'll start with looking at some praise and criticisms of modern industrial capitalism. Now, just so you're aware, the reading that I've assigned is essentially ultimately coming down on the side of praising capitalism. But I think it's important to just sort of bring to light some of the strongest criticisms as well. Then we'll look at the claim that capitalism is founded on property rights and free and open markets. We'll move on to look at a number of archetypes of capitalism, these being laissez-faire, state-guided, oligarchic, big firm, entrepreneurial, and anarchic. And again, I'll note that both laissez-faire and anarchic are not in the reading, but I think it's important to mention them. Lastly, we'll sort of restate some of the criticisms of capitalism that we already will cover in or will have covered in section 1, namely inequality, market failures, morality, and the environment. Okay, so just take a look at this slide here which gives you a sketch of modern industrial capitalism. And the time period we're looking at is roughly from the mid-1700s to the early 1900s. So roughly somewhere around 1760-ish to around 1915-ish, although some of the processes that we'll describe are ongoing in some parts of the world. So we'll look at these just quickly. Productive energy provided by burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. And of course, if you want to anticipate what the negative side of this might be, I want to encourage you at any point in this lecture to just pause it and ask yourself, what might be the sort of, the negative side of these aspects of capitalism? Widespread production of various anthropically useful, which just means useful to human materials, and I've given you a list there. Probably concrete and brick make up the most in terms of sheer mass, but there is a lot of all the other stuff like steel, and steel is important because when you combine it with concrete in the form of steel reinforced concrete, that's what makes possible things like skyscrapers, and that's why there are no skyscrapers in pre-modern societies. Next, we've got the mechanical exploitation of plants and animals using machines equipped with internal combustion engines, which are burning the coal, oil, and gas that I mentioned above. The pharmaceuticals and fertilizers that are used will include things like nitrogen for fertilizer and various antibiotics, hormones, steroids, and other kinds of things that you've probably heard of. Specialization of labor, meaning that people who work in the workforce typically will do a relatively specialized job. And you combine that with widespread socioeconomic stratification, which we'll talk about in a moment. Money-based economies, in other words, using money as opposed to just trading goods without any kind of universal currency, in large spatially concentrated centers like factories and offices, which then in turn led to the growth of huge modern cities like New York City, for example. Okay, and finally, much, maybe even most of scientific and technological attention dedicated to assisting industry. Again, if you want to contrast this with pre-modern societies, we won't necessarily need to cover all of these, but I just want to quickly run through a couple of them. Productive energy in pre-modern societies was primarily provided by human muscles in the form of slavery, at least for many societies. Also sometimes to some extent by the sun. So for example, think of the drying of mud bricks using the sun. Wind in the form of wind for the powering of particularly travel by sea, but also wind used for the things like grinding grains in windmills, water for water mills, and also, of course, navigating by sea. And of course, finally, the use of animals as an energy source. Okay, and just a couple more other things, just looking at the specialization of labor. Pre-modern economies often had individuals who could do multiple tasks instead of just one. I'll give you an example. There's a fairly well-known philosopher named Sidney Shoemaker. And that name Shoemaker should give you this idea that there were people in the past who made shoes from beginning to end, so to speak, right? So they made the bottom of the shoe, the top of the shoe, they attached the top of the shoe to the bottom of the shoe, and so on. Whereas now, that's not how shoes are made. Most people do only one part of some job. So for example, the author of the book typically is not also the publisher of the book. And the publisher of the book also is usually not the editor of the book. So even in the production of something like books, which are relatively simple to produce, nevertheless, you still have specialization. Okay, next, we just want to look at why this is supposed to be good. And here's the claim that the author of our reading makes. Under certain conditions, market capitalism allocates resources efficiently, producing the optimal outcome that maximizes social welfare. In other words, everyone is better off because of capitalism. Okay, so because of capitalism, with this kind of efficiency, everybody can have what they need, they can pursue lives that they want, and they can become happy. And I'll just give you a couple of statistics that are often used by supporters of capitalism. And from now on, when I say capitalism, I mean modern industrial capitalism. Let's take a look at this chart showing global population. And you'll see that global population starts to really go up once the Industrial Revolution is underway, conjoined with modern industrial capitalism. So people will point to this growth in population and say, see, here's an example of capitalism at work. Not only are there more human beings alive, but there's more food to feed those human beings and more clothes to clothe those human beings, etc., etc. Next, we can take a look at this chart showing the progress of global literacy, which again, you can see from the sort of middle of the Industrial Revolution up until the present, has been going up in almost every place that you check in the world. Okay, so that seems to indicate that not only is capitalism providing the possibility of human life, that is more human beings alive, but also is making lives better, where literacy is a kind of indicator of a good life. And similarly, we can look at this chart showing the average years of schooling in Asia, which has had recently, at least since this chart starts in the 1950s, some of the most challenges with respect to the living conditions of their populations. Nevertheless, the education level in Asia has steadily gone up despite whatever challenges that they might be facing. Okay, so there you have in a nutshell the case for capitalism. And what I want to do now is just give you a sense of what anti-capitalists might say. The first thing they might say is this: it wasn't capitalism that made the growth in human population possible. Rather, it was public health measures carried out by state governments, not corporations or companies. And to see this, I just want to read to you a quick kind of passage that helps explain why this might be. Industrialization and rapid population growth became an increasing source of concern during the 1820s and 1830s. Deadly epidemics such as cholera wreaked havoc and instilled fear among both the working classes and elites. Industrialization in itself was not sufficient for sanitary reform. A fundamental shift in the conceptualization and understanding of disease causation was needed. This shift, in turn, encouraged local politicians to commit substantial resources to the construction of expensive waterworks and sewage systems throughout a country. Of course, this process was fraught with difficulties and marked by periods of progress and regression. Okay, so that's one thing to say, is that it wasn't capitalism, it was public health that allowed human populations to grow. But let's also talk a little bit about some of the downsides of living in modern day industrial capitalism. So for example, the general estimates of how many slaves exist today is roughly 50 million, and that apparently seems to be the most in human history. So there are more slaves currently in the world than there have ever been. Roughly 700 million. Now, the global population is between 8 and 9 million, so you got to realize that 700 million is a decent chunk of the entire global population is living in poverty, defined as less than $2.50 per day. And also, just as a note we'll talk about later, much of those people living in poverty are malnourished. And we can look at a lot of other sort of atrocities and murders and killing that has gone under the, that have happened under the era of capitalism, including things like the Jewish Holocaust, the World Wars, Great Leap Forward, and of course I'll just mention that humans kill over 1 trillion animals per year, the most in human history. And species extinction is occurring at 1 to 10 times the background rate for the fossil record. Next, we'll just take a quick look at malnutrition and just take a look at that number on the far right-hand side is pretty alarming. 795 million people do not get the food that they need to live to live a healthy life. So that again is a large chunk of the global population, almost 1/10 in fact. And 1.9 billion are overweight or obese, which both are forms of malnutrition. 2 billion people suffer from some form of micronutrient deficiency. Why is this important? All right, well, consider the deficiency in iron. This can lead to anemia, which can lead to a weakened immune system. So there are all sorts of other bad health effects that can occur for those people who are micronutrient deficient. Next, we'll just take a quick look at the global distribution of wealth, where the top 1 get more than 50%, or excuse me, the top 1% own more than 50% of the world's wealth. The next 4%, another 26%, and so on and so forth. So deep inequality in wealth also developed under capitalism. And then in the next image you see there, we've got living biomass compared to human-made mass, where a lot of the human-made mass is waste. So plastic, 4 gigatons, animals, plastic, 8 gigatons, animals, 4 gigatons. So that is to say there's twice as much plastic in mass than there are animals on the planet Earth. Similarly, we can see biomass for all living things on Earth compared to the anthropogenic math. Anthropogenic just means made by humans. And by 2020, which is actually passed, we have now surpassed the amount of biomass with anthropogenic mass. And last but not least, this is probably the most important, the average temperature. And we can see that it looks like, arguably, the increase in global average temperature can be attributed directly to industrial capitalism, and that threatens all life on Earth. Okay, so what does our author have to say about this? Our author has to say this: is there a way to achieve capitalism's high economic performance without the heavy social cost? Okay, and his argument is that the creation of such an economy begins with fidelity to the values embedded in capitalism itself. What kind of values? Economic liberty, private property rights, open and fair markets, and free market clarity. Markets can properly work only if consumers are autonomous and well-informed enough to make sound economic choices. Markets also greatly depend on trust and cooperation. Lying, fraud, cheating, and deception subvert free markets and cause them to fail. So the summary idea is that economic activity should ideally take place within a free polity under the rule of law and within a culture that emphasizes the benefits and burdens of personal and corporate moral responsibility. All right, so now we're going to look at that argument in more detail.